I had been home from Tulsa for less than 5 minutes when I found my wife sitting alone in our back bedroom, crying without making a sound. Eleanor and I had been married 41 years, and I'd seen her truly cry maybe 5 times. But that afternoon, tears were running down her face, her hair was unbrushed, and the gray sweatshirt she wore seemed 2 sizes too big. I knelt in front of her and took her hands. They were ice cold. "Eleanor, what happened?" She wouldn't look at me. "Honey, talk to me." She only shook her head. Then I noticed something worse. My wife looked smaller. Not older, smaller. Like someone had been slowly taking pieces of her away while I was gone. And before that night ended, I would realize that while I was 300 miles away working, someone I trusted as family had been coming into my house every day. Before I tell you what I discovered, subscribe to Calm Dad Stories and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because sometimes the first warning that something terrible has happened isn't what someone tells you. It's what they suddenly become too frightened to say. My name is Hollis Knight. I'm 68 years old. I'd spent 3 weeks working a contract job in Tulsa, and the entire drive home I'd pictured Eleanor outside in her garden. Instead, when I pulled into our driveway, the garden looked abandoned. Tomatoes were split open on the ground. Basil had gone to seed. Weeds had taken over the beds. Eleanor loved that garden almost as much as she loved me. Even after her hip surgery in July, she refused to let me water the tomatoes without giving me instructions. She would never willingly let it get like this. Before I left for Tulsa, I'd almost canceled the job because she was still recovering. Eleanor insisted I go. Then, our daughter-in-law, Marisol, volunteered to help. "Don't worry about anything," she'd told me. "I'll bring groceries. I'll check on her every day. Family takes care of family." I remember thanking her. Now I stood beside the woman she'd supposedly been caring for and barely recognized my own wife. "I want to go to bed," Eleanor finally whispered. It was 4 in the afternoon. I helped her up. 3 weeks earlier, she'd been walking confidently with a cane. Now she moved down the hallway with one hand against the wall, like every step required permission from her body. I helped her into bed and sat beside her until she fell asleep. Then I went into the kitchen. Something felt wrong there, too. The refrigerator was almost empty. Spoiled milk. 3 unopened yogurts already past their dates. A jar of pickles. Nothing Eleanor would have called a meal. This was a woman who considered an empty refrigerator a personal failure. I opened cabinets, checked the freezer, then noticed a bathroom scale beside the back door. Eleanor normally kept it upstairs. Underneath was a small notepad covered in her handwriting. Dates on the left, numbers on the right. The first entry was 141, then 138, 135, 132. The final number, written 2 days earlier, was 128. I stared at it until the meaning settled in. Eleanor had lost 13 pounds in less than 3 weeks. My hands began to shake. I checked the trash and found a styrofoam container from the diner on Route 9. Someone had written a name across the lid in black marker, Marisol. I stood there holding it. Marisol had promised to bring groceries. She had promised to make sure Eleanor ate. Yet my wife was 13 pounds lighter. The refrigerator was empty, and she was too frightened to tell me why. I looked toward the hallway where Eleanor was sleeping. Then another thought came to me. 4 years earlier, after several break-ins on our road, I'd installed a motion-activated security camera above the garage. I'd almost forgotten it existed. But if Marisol had really been coming to my house every day for the past 3 weeks, that camera would know. I walked into the garage, climbed into my truck, and opened the security app on my phone. Hundreds of recordings appeared. I scrolled back to the morning I left for Tulsa. Then I saw the first familiar blue Honda pull into my driveway. Marisol had arrived, and I pressed play. Marisol had arrived, and I pressed play. The first clip was from my second day in Tulsa. Her blue Honda pulled into the driveway at 11:06 in the morning. She got out carrying a grocery bag, disappeared inside, then returned 40 minutes later carrying the same bag, only lighter. Nothing alarming by itself. She had promised to bring Eleanor groceries. The next day she came again. Then again that evening. By the 4th day, I realized there wasn't a single 24-hour period when Marisol hadn't been at my house. Sometimes she came twice. once at 6:17 in the morning, another night after 10. I sat in the dark garage scrolling through timestamps, trying to convince myself there was an innocent explanation. Maybe Eleanor needed more help than she'd admitted. Maybe Marisol had genuinely been taking care of her. But the woman asleep inside had lost 13 pounds, while supposedly receiving daily groceries. That fact wouldn't leave me alone. Then I noticed something else. Marisol almost always parked her Honda at an angle near the front of the driveway, blocking the clearest view of our living room window from the road. At first I thought it was coincidence. Then I watched 17 separate arrivals. Same position, same angle, same obstruction. I stopped thinking like a husband and started thinking like the lineman I'd been for 36 years. When something fails, you don't stare at the broken piece. You trace the line backward until you find where the trouble began. I went back to the earliest footage. On the 7th afternoon, our neighbor Mrs. Hennings appeared carrying a covered casserole. She was 79, a retired schoolteacher who had known Eleanor for more than 20 years. She rang the bell. Marisol opened the door. Mrs. Hennings gestured toward the inside as if asking to see Eleanor. Marisol never stepped aside. She stood squarely in the doorway, smiling, talking, blocking every inch of access. After 2 minutes, Mrs. Hennings handed her the casserole and walked home looking confused. At 6:03 the following morning, the camera caught Marisol leaving my house carrying that same covered dish. She put it in her car and drove away. I replayed the clip. Then again, someone had brought food to my wife, and Marisol had removed it before Eleanor could eat it. I kept searching. 2 days later, a woman from Eleanor's church pulled into the driveway. Marisol met her outside. She never entered. Another afternoon, a delivery driver carried 2 grocery bags to the porch. Less than 10 minutes later, Marisol arrived. When she left, one of those bags went with her. By then, I wasn't looking at random visits anymore. I was looking at a pattern. Marisol wasn't simply checking on Eleanor. She was controlling who reached her, what stayed in the house, and possibly what she ate. I shut off my phone and sat there listening to the garage settle around me. Every part of me wanted to drive straight to Daniel's house and demand an explanation from his wife. But I still didn't know what had happened inside my home, and Eleanor was in no condition to be dragged into a confrontation. So I went back inside. She was asleep, facing the wall. I stood at the bedroom door and made myself a promise. I would find out exactly what had happened during those 21 days before Marisol knew I suspected anything. That night, I didn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I made coffee and started sorting through the pile of mail Eleanor had left in the wooden bowl by the kitchen door. Bills, advertisements, church newsletters. Then I found an envelope from our bank. I almost put it aside until one sentence showed through the window. Confirmation of authorized signer. I opened it. The letter confirmed that an additional person had been granted access to the checking account Eleanor and I had shared for more than 30 years. I hadn't authorized anyone. I looked at the name printed beneath mine, Marisol Vega. Suddenly, the empty refrigerator and the blocked visitors looked like only the beginning. I read Marisol's name 3 times before setting the bank letter on the table. She wasn't supposed to have access to our checking account. Not temporarily, not for emergencies, not for any reason. Eleanor and I had handled our own finances for 41 years. If either of us wanted to add another signer, we would have discussed it first. I searched the envelope for an explanation. The authorization had been processed 12 days earlier, right in the middle of my Tulsa job. That timing bothered me almost as much as the name. I pulled the security footage back up and started comparing dates. The day before the authorization was processed, Marisol had arrived at 9:14 p.m. and stayed nearly 2 hours. The camera couldn't show me what happened inside, but now every late-night visit carried a different meaning. I grabbed a legal pad and began building a timeline. September 8, Marisol arrived twice. September 9, 3 visits. September 10, Mrs. Hennings turned away. September 11, casserole removed. September 13, church visitor stopped outside. September 15, Marisol arrived after 10 at night. For 21 days, she had controlled access to my wife while I was 300 miles away. I walked back to the bedroom and looked at Eleanor sleeping. I wanted to wake her and ask about the bank immediately, but she looked exhausted, so I returned to the kitchen and kept searching. Under the bank letter was an unopened envelope from our financial advisor. Inside was confirmation of a withdrawal request from our retirement account. $22,000. The request had supposedly been authorized by Eleanor. I stared at her signature. It looked like hers, but the letters were shaky and uneven, nothing like the handwriting she'd had for decades as a schoolteacher. I set it beside the weight log. Same trembling strokes. My stomach tightened. Then I found another letter from our credit union. A new $40,000 home equity line of credit had been opened against the house. Again, paperwork had been processed while I was in Tulsa. Again, Eleanor's signature appeared at the bottom. I stood up and walked around the kitchen because suddenly sitting still felt impossible. In less than 3 weeks, my wife had lost 13 pounds, been isolated from neighbors, added Marisol to our checking account, authorized a $22,000 retirement withdrawal, and signed paperwork placing $40,000 of our home equity within reach. Those weren't separate coincidences anymore. They were steps. And every step had happened while Eleanor was frightened, physically weakened, and alone. I went back to the wooden mail bowl and emptied everything onto the table. At the very bottom was a folded sheet of yellow legal paper. The handwriting was Eleanor's, but shakier than anything else I'd found. It wasn't a letter. It was a list. Beside each date, she'd written what Marisol had asked her to sign or hand over. Bank authorization, retirement paperwork, credit union forms, jewelry box, insurance documents. I followed the list downward until I reached the final entry. House deed. I stopped. Our house was paid for. Eleanor and I had bought it 34 years earlier, raised Daniel there, remodeled the kitchen twice, and planned to stay until somebody carried us out. Why would Marisol need anything involving our deed? Then I saw the sentence underneath. Eleanor had written it smaller than everything else, almost squeezed into the bottom margin. I am so sorry. I didn't know how to stop. I sat down. For the first time since coming home, the question wasn't whether my wife had made bad financial decisions while I was gone. Those 9 words told me she hadn't believed she was making choices at all. She had been afraid. I put my head in my hands and stayed that way for several minutes. Then I heard movement behind me. Eleanor was standing in the kitchen doorway, one hand gripping the frame. Her eyes went immediately to the yellow page in front of me. The color drained from her face. "You found it," she whispered. I stood slowly. "Yes." She started crying. Hollis, I tried to stop her. I crossed the room and held her before she could fall. "You don't have to explain anything tonight." But Eleanor shook her head against my chest. "No, you need to know." She pulled away and looked at me. "Marisol told me you weren't coming home from Tulsa." I stared at her. "What?" Eleanor swallowed. "She told me you'd found another woman, and that if I called you, the stress would kill you." She told me you'd found another woman, and that if I called you, the stress would kill you. For a few seconds, I couldn't understand how those words could have come from anyone who called us family. Eleanor lowered herself into a kitchen chair and stared at the yellow page between us. I wanted answers, but I could see she was barely holding herself together. "We'll talk when you're ready," I said. "First, I need to know whether there's anything else Marisol had you sign." Eleanor's eyes moved toward the stack of mail. "I don't know." That answer frightened me. "You don't remember? There were so many papers." I sat beside her. "Then we don't guess. We find out." After Eleanor went back to bed, I spread every document across the dining room table and started building a record. The $22,000 retirement withdrawal had been approved 11 days after I left. The $40,000 home equity line followed 4 days later. Marisol had been added as an authorized signer on our checking account between those 2 transactions. None of it looked accidental anymore. I logged into our bank account. The balance was lower than it should have been. I pulled 90 days of transactions and found withdrawals I didn't recognize. $800, $1,000, $200, $600, $1,500. Most were ATM transactions. Several occurred within an hour of Marisol appearing on the garage camera. Then I found 2 checks written to cash, one for $2,400, another for $3,000. Eleanor's signature was on both, but it looked weak and uneven. I printed everything. At 7:15 the next morning, I called our financial advisor, Martin Graves. "Martin, did Eleanor request $22,000 from the IRA?" Silence. "Hollis, she signed the authorization." "Did you speak to her?" Another pause. "Marisol brought her in." My grip tightened around the phone. "Was Eleanor alone with you at any point?" "No." That told me enough. I asked him to freeze any pending distributions until he heard from my attorney. Then I called the credit union about the home equity line. Same pattern. Marisol had accompanied Eleanor. Marisol had explained most of the paperwork. Eleanor had signed. But the worst discovery came from the county property portal. I searched our address and opened the most recent filing. A document had been submitted requesting that Marisol be added to the property through a transfer instrument. It wasn't complete yet. The filing was still pending review. I stared at the screen. The house Eleanor and I had paid off after 30 years of work was days away from becoming entangled with our daughter-in-law. I immediately called the county clerk and told her the transfer was disputed and potentially obtained through coercion. She flagged the filing for review and told me to contact counsel. By 9 that morning, I had a stack of documents nearly an inch thick. 13 pounds lost, visitors blocked, food removed, bank access changed, retirement money withdrawn, home equity opened, property paperwork submitted. It wasn't one bad decision. It was a system. Marisol had isolated Eleanor first, weakened her second, frightened her third, and only then started putting papers in front of her. I walked into the bedroom carrying none of the documents. Eleanor was awake, staring toward the window. I sat beside her. "Honey, I need you to hear something before you tell me anything else. The bank can be frozen. The retirement withdrawal can be traced. The property filing can be challenged. Whatever you signed, we'll deal with it." Her eyes filled immediately. "You aren't angry? At you? No. I should have known better. You were recovering from surgery, and you were alone." She looked down. "I wasn't alone." Her voice became almost inaudible. "That was the problem." I waited. Eleanor took a long breath. "The first few days Marisol was wonderful. She brought food, helped me shower, sat with me. Then what changed? She started asking questions about our accounts, about the house, about your retirement." Eleanor twisted the blanket between her fingers. "When I told her those things were private, she said you had already discussed everything with Daniel. I never did. I know that now." She wiped her eyes. "Then she told me you were seeing someone in Tulsa. She said you were planning to leave me and that you didn't want to come home." I felt anger rise but kept my voice steady. "And when you tried to call me?" Eleanor finally looked directly at me. "That's when she told me about your heart." "My heart?" "She said you'd been having chest pains. She said the doctor warned that stress could trigger a fatal heart attack." I stared at her. I'd never had a heart condition in my life. Eleanor's next words explained why my phone conversations with her had become shorter every night. "She told me that if I upset you with questions, and you died because of it, it would be my fault. She told me that if I upset you with questions, and you died because of it, it would be my fault." I had to look away from Eleanor because I didn't want her to see what those words did to me. Marisol hadn't needed locks or threats of violence. She had found the one thing my wife feared most, losing me, and turned it into a weapon. "Tell me exactly what happened," I said, "from the beginning." Eleanor took a long breath. "During the first 3 days after I left, Marisol behaved exactly as she'd promised. She brought groceries, helped with Eleanor's medication, changed the dressing from her hip surgery, and stayed for hours. Then she began telling Eleanor that I wasn't answering Daniel's calls, that I was spending evenings with a woman from the Tulsa office, that I'd told Daniel I was tired of being responsible for an aging wife. "I knew it didn't sound like you," Eleanor whispered. "Then why did you believe her?" "Because every time I tried calling, you were working." She was right. The contract had me on 12-hour shifts, and several nights I'd returned Eleanor's calls late. Marisol had taken ordinary circumstances and arranged them into a lie. Then came the heart story. She told Eleanor I'd secretly seen a cardiologist and had dangerous chest pains. From that point forward, every time Eleanor wanted to question me, Marisol warned her not to stress Hollis. She'd sit beside me while I called you, Eleanor said. That's why you kept saying everything was fine? She nodded. She was listening. My stomach tightened. Marisol's control hadn't stopped with phone calls. She told Mrs. Hennings that Eleanor needed complete rest. She turned away church friends. She took food people brought because it supposedly interfered with Eleanor's post-surgery diet. Then she began controlling what Eleanor ate herself. Some days she'd bring soup, Eleanor said. Other days she'd tell me I'd already eaten and forgotten. You believe that? After a while, I didn't know what to believe. Weak from surgery, frightened about me, and increasingly isolated, Eleanor began doubting her own memory. That was when the paperwork started. First came the checking account authorization. Marisol said it would allow her to buy groceries without bothering Eleanor. Then the retirement withdrawal. She claimed Daniel needed temporary help, and that I'd already approved it. The home equity documents came next. I told her no. Eleanor's voice broke. I told her I wanted to wait until you came home. What did she say? She said if I didn't sign, she'd call you in Tulsa and tell you I'd discovered the other woman. I stared at her. And she said the shock might trigger your heart. Eleanor covered her face. So I signed. I moved beside her and held her until the shaking stopped. Then she told me about the deed. Marisol had brought those papers on my 18th day away. Eleanor refused twice. On the third attempt, Marisol placed her phone on the table and said she would call me immediately unless Eleanor cooperated. She said, "If Hollis dies tonight, remember that you chose this." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. "That's why you wrote the note?" I asked. Eleanor nodded. "I thought when you came home, you'd think I'd given everything away willingly. Never. I needed you to know I tried. I know now." She looked at me with exhausted eyes. "There's something else." My chest tightened. Eleanor told me that during the final week, she had begun secretly recording Marisol on an old digital recorder she once used for church committee meetings. She'd hidden it inside a sewing basket beside her chair. "Do you still have it?" "I think so." We went to the living room together. Beneath spools of thread and folded fabric, I found a silver recorder no larger than my palm. The battery was nearly dead. I plugged it into my laptop and found 7 audio files. On the 4th recording, Marisol's voice came through clearly. "Sign it, Eleanor. Hollis doesn't need to know about any of this until everything is finished." Then Eleanor's weak voice. "I want my husband." Marisol answered immediately. Then stopped giving me reasons to call him and upset his heart. I paused the recording. For the first time since coming home, we had more than suspicious paperwork and camera footage. We had Marisol's own voice. Eleanor touched my arm. "What are you going to do?" Every angry part of me wanted to drive straight to Marisol's house. Instead, I copied those 7 files onto 2 separate drives. "I'm going to make sure she never gets another chance to tell anyone you chose this." Then I picked up my phone and called the first person who could help me turn what we'd found into something Marisol couldn't talk her way out of. My attorney, Carlton Pruitt. Carlton Pruitt had been our family attorney for 25 years. When his secretary heard my voice, she gave me the first appointment available. 10 o'clock. Bring everything. Before leaving, I locked every door in the house, slid a 2x4 into the back door track, and told Eleanor not to answer Marisol's calls. Then I spent nearly 2 hours downloading every garage camera clip onto a thumb drive. I wasn't good with computers, but I wasn't going to lose 3 weeks of evidence because I couldn't figure out where the save button was. At 9, I drove to our bank. The branch manager, Tatum, had known Eleanor and me for 15 years. I placed the authorized signer letter on her desk. "I didn't approve this." My wife was coerced. "I want this account frozen, and I want every transaction from the last 30 days. Tatum studied my face. "Hollis, has someone been taking advantage of Eleanor?" "Yes." "Family?" I nodded. She disappeared for 20 minutes and returned carrying a thick folder. What I saw inside turned suspicion into numbers. ATM withdrawals Eleanor couldn't have made while recovering from hip surgery. Checks written to cash. electronic transfers into an account bearing Marisol's name. Then I found one withdrawal that made me stop. $9,000 in a single transaction. By the time I left, our compromised account was frozen. A new account had been opened, and the fraud department had been notified. From there, I drove directly to Carlton's office. I placed everything on his conference table: bank records, retirement documents, the disputed home equity line, the pending property filing, Eleanor's handwritten list, security footage, and copies of the recordings she'd made. Carlton listened without interrupting. When the fourth audio file played, Marisol's voice filled the room. "Sign it, Eleanor. Hollis doesn't need to know until everything is finished." Carlton stopped the recording. "Hollis, listen carefully. This isn't a disagreement over family money. I know. This is potentially coercion, financial exploitation, fraud, and elder abuse." He leaned forward. "Do you want me to try resolving this privately, or do you want every legal consequence available?" For 1 second, I thought about Daniel. Then I pictured Eleanor sitting alone in that back bedroom, 13 pounds lighter and afraid that calling her own husband might kill him. "Every consequence the law allows." Carlton nodded. "Then you do not confront Marisol." That was the hardest instruction he could have given me. Why? Because right now, she doesn't know what you have. If you confront her, she gets time to move money, destroy messages, change her story, or pressure Eleanor again. We do this correctly. He immediately contacted the county clerk regarding the property filing and began preparing emergency documents, challenging everything Eleanor had signed under duress. Then he called Deputy Reyes from the sheriff's elder fraud unit. I remembered Reyes from a presentation she'd once given to Eleanor's bridge group. Less than an hour later, she was sitting across from us, reviewing the evidence. "Does Marisol know you've found any of this?" she asked. "No. Keep it that way." Reyes wanted the original recordings preserved, the camera files untouched, and Eleanor's written account completed while her memory was fresh. She also requested bank records directly through official channels so nobody could later argue I'd altered anything. Before I left, Carlton gave me the timeline. "Give us 48 hours. I can move to challenge the documents. Reyes can take this where it needs to go. Until then, keep Eleanor safe and act normal." I drove home, carrying less anger than I'd had that morning, but far more purpose. Eleanor was sitting at the kitchen table drinking tea, writing everything she remembered on a yellow pad. "She called 4 times, she said. "You answered?" "No." Right then the phone rang again. Marisol appeared on the caller ID. Neither of us touched it. The answering machine clicked on. Her voice floated through our kitchen, warm and concerned. "Hi, Mom. Just checking on you. I haven't heard from you today and I'm getting worried. Call me back, okay? Love you." Eleanor closed her eyes. I reached across the table and took her hand. Marisol still believed. She was the only person who knew what had happened during those 21 days. She had no idea the bank was frozen, the property transfer was being challenged, her voice was sitting in an evidence file, and an elder fraud investigator now knew her name. But there was still one person who had to learn the truth before this was over. My son Daniel was returning from Wisconsin the next morning, and I had no idea whether he was about to discover what his wife had done, or whether I was about to discover that he'd known all along. Daniel called at 8:12 the next morning. "Dad, I just got back into cell service. I've got 15 voicemails from Marisol. What the hell is going on?" I looked across the kitchen at Eleanor. "Son, come to the house. Right now." "Marisol says Mom's having some kind of breakdown. She says you came home from Tulsa angry and started accusing her of things." So the story had already begun. "Come alone, Daniel. Don't tell Marisol you're coming here. Tell her you're stopping at the office." There was a pause. "Dad, you're scaring me." "Good. Then you'll listen." 25 minutes later, Daniel walked through our front door. He was 42, a foot taller than me, still wearing the hunting jacket he'd driven home in. He hugged Eleanor first. The moment he felt how thin she was, his expression changed. "Mom, what happened to you?" Eleanor couldn't answer. "Sit down," I said. I started with the day I'd returned from Tulsa. I told him about the dying garden, Eleanor crying in the back room, the 13 pounds she'd lost, and the empty refrigerator. Then I opened my laptop. Daniel watched Marisol's blue Honda appear again and again. He watched his wife block Mrs. Hennings from entering. He watched the casserole leave the next morning. Dad, keep watching. Next came the bank letter showing Marisol as an authorized signer. Then, the $22,000 IRA withdrawal, the $40,000 home equity line, the disputed property filing, and the transfers into Marisol's account. Daniel stopped me. No, she wouldn't do this. I didn't argue. I simply played Eleanor's recording. Marisol's voice filled the living room. Sign it, Eleanor. Hollis doesn't need to know about any of this until everything is finished. Then Eleanor's voice. I want my husband, and Marisol again. Then stop giving me reasons to call him and upset his heart. Daniel went completely still. I watched my son's face because there was one question I still needed answered. How much did you know? His head snapped toward me. Nothing. Think carefully before you answer. Dad, I swear to God. She told me Mom was depressed after surgery. She said Mom was embarrassed about needing help and didn't want me interfering. Did Marisol tell you anything about our money? No. Did any unusual money appear in your accounts while I was gone? Daniel opened his mouth to say no, then stopped. That hesitation made my stomach tighten. What? I asked. There was $15,000. When? About a week ago. Where did it come from? Marisol said she closed a big real estate deal. She told me it was commission money and transferred it into our savings. I slid the bank records toward him. Son, I think your wife's commission may have come from your mother. Daniel stared at the pages. The color disappeared from his face. No. He stood abruptly and walked toward the bathroom. Seconds later, I heard him being sick. When he returned, he looked older, not metaphorically. Something in my son's face had changed. He sat beside Eleanor and took her hand. Mom, I'm sorry. Eleanor shook her head. You didn't know. I should have known. Daniel. She squeezed his fingers. She lied to you too. He looked at me. What happens now? Nothing from you. His expression hardened. Dad, listen to me. Carlton is challenging the documents. Deputy Reyes is building the criminal case. Marisol cannot know we have this evidence until they're ready. You want me to go home to her? For one night. Daniel stood and paced toward the window. After what she did to Mom, if you confront her now, she can destroy evidence, move money, or run. Can you act normal for 24 hours? He stared outside for a long time. Then he turned around. Yes. You're sure? Daniel looked at Eleanor. She did this to my mother. She used my children to keep Mom isolated. And she put stolen money into my account so I'd become part of it without knowing. His jaw tightened. Yes, Dad. I can wait one night. He started toward the door, then stopped. What do I tell the kids? I thought about my 7-year-old grandson and 4-year-old granddaughter. Tell them Grandma got sick, but she's getting better. Tell them next weekend they're coming here to make biscuits with her. Daniel nodded. Then my 42-year-old son hugged me the way he had when he was 12. Dad, he whispered, don't let her get away with this. She won't. He left. I watched his truck disappear down the road, knowing exactly where he was going. Back into the same house as Marisol, carrying the truth she couldn't know he had. For the next 24 hours, my son would have to sit across from his wife and pretend he still believed every lie she'd told him. For the next 24 hours, my son would have to sit across from his wife and pretend he still believed every lie she'd told him. I hated asking Daniel to do it, but Carlton had been clear. One angry confrontation could destroy weeks of evidence in minutes. So we waited. That afternoon, Marisol called our house 6 times. Eleanor didn't answer once. At 5:40, she left another message. Mom, I'm getting worried. Daniel says Hollis is home, but nobody's calling me back. Please don't let him upset you. I watched Eleanor's face tighten at the sound of that sweet voice. Turn it off, she whispered. I did. At 7:15, Daniel texted me 2 words. She's suspicious. I didn't reply. We had agreed there would be no unnecessary messages. Later, he told me Marisol had spent dinner asking why he'd stopped at my house, what I'd said about Tulsa, whether Eleanor had complained about anything, and whether I'd opened the mail. Daniel told her I'd been tired from the drive and Eleanor was sleeping. Then he ate dinner across from the woman he had been married to for 9 years, while knowing investigators were preparing to arrest her. The next morning, Carlton called at 8:03. The emergency filings challenging the deed transfer and financial authorizations had been submitted. The county had frozen the property filing. The IRA distribution was under dispute. The bank's fraud department had preserved the transaction history. "Now we wait on Reyes," he said. At 11:26, Deputy Reyes called. She had obtained what she needed to move forward. "Do not contact Marisol," she warned. "Do not tell Daniel to leave early. We don't want her realizing anything has changed." I looked through the kitchen window at Eleanor sitting in the garden for the first time since I'd returned. She wasn't gardening yet. She was simply sitting in the sun. But seeing her outside felt like watching someone slowly return to herself. At 12:40, Daniel called from his office. His voice was low. "Dad, she just asked whether you found the yellow paper." My stomach tightened. "What did you say?" I asked. "What yellow paper?" She changed the subject. Marisol knew enough to be nervous. "Don't go home," I said. "Reyes told me to act normal. Then act normal until she tells you otherwise." At 2:17, my phone rang again. This time it was Deputy Reyes. "Hollis, we're moving." Those 2 words changed the air in the room. Eleanor looked at me. I nodded. She didn't smile. Neither did I. There was nothing satisfying about what was happening. This was my son's wife, the mother of my grandchildren. But she had also spent 21 days convincing Eleanor that her husband would die if she resisted. At 3:05, Daniel received instructions to remain at work and not contact Marisol. At 3:22, 2 unmarked vehicles entered the parking lot of the real estate office where Marisol worked. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. Deputy Reyes called me afterward and told me exactly what happened. Marisol had been sitting at her desk talking to a client when Reyes and another investigator approached. "Marisol Vega?" She looked up and smiled. "Yes?" Reyes identified herself. The smile disappeared. Marisol asked what this was about. Reyes told her to stand and place her hands where they could be seen. According to the office manager, every person in that room stopped working. Marisol's first response wasn't to ask about Eleanor. It wasn't to ask whether someone had been hurt. She said, "This is a misunderstanding. Eleanor gave me permission." Reyes hadn't mentioned Eleanor's name. When she told me that, I closed my eyes. Even at the moment the handcuffs came out, Marisol was already building her defense. By 4, Daniel had filed for emergency custody of the children with Carlton's help. By evening, the property transfer was formally blocked, and Marisol no longer had access to our accounts. Eleanor and I sat at the kitchen table without saying much. Then she asked, "Is it over?" I took her hand. "The part where she can hurt you is," but the criminal case was only beginning. Marisol's attorney would soon claim Eleanor had willingly signed everything, that this was nothing more than a family disagreement over money. Unfortunately for him, he didn't yet know about the one piece of evidence Eleanor had created while she was frightened, isolated, and supposedly helpless. Her own recording of Marisol's voice. Her own recording of Marisol's voice. That was the evidence her attorney didn't know existed. Within 48 hours of the arrest, Marisol's defense began exactly as Carlton predicted. Eleanor had been lonely after surgery. Eleanor had voluntarily asked Marisol for financial help. Eleanor had willingly signed every document. The $22,000 IRA withdrawal was supposedly a family loan. The $40,000 home equity line was intended for renovations. Even the money transferred into Marisol's account, her attorney claimed, had been authorized by Eleanor as repayment for months of caregiving expenses. I listened to Carlton explain all of it from across his conference table. "Can they actually make that work?" I asked. "If this were only signatures and competing stories, they could create doubt." He tapped the evidence folder. "But this isn't only signatures." Investigators had already matched Marisol's bank activity against the garage camera timestamps. Several ATM withdrawals occurred shortly after she left our house. The $9,000 withdrawal had been deposited into an account she controlled. The supposed $15,000 real estate commission transferred into Daniel's savings traced back through funds taken from Eleanor and me. Then came the camera footage. Neighbors turned away, food removed, Marisol entering at unusual hours while Eleanor became progressively weaker. None of it alone proved coercion. Together it showed a pattern. But the recordings changed everything. Eleanor agreed to a formal interview with Deputy Reyes. I sat beside her while she described those 21 days from beginning to end. Her voice shook at first. Then Reyes played the fourth recording. Marisol's voice filled the room. "Sign it, Eleanor. Hollis doesn't need to know about any of this until everything is finished." Eleanor's recorded voice answered, "I want my husband." Then Marisol, "Then stop giving me reasons to call him and upset his heart." Nobody spoke when the audio ended. Reyes played another file. This time Eleanor could be heard refusing to sign paperwork involving the house. Marisol responded, "If Hollis dies tonight because you upset him, that's something you'll have to live with." I had heard it before, but hearing it inside an interview room was different. It stripped away every polite explanation Marisol's attorney had offered. This wasn't a daughter-in-law helping a confused older woman manage finances. It was fear being deliberately manufactured and then used to obtain signatures. Daniel filed for divorce immediately and received temporary custody arrangements that kept the children away from Marisol while the criminal case proceeded. He also surrendered the $15,000 in disputed funds rather than touch a dollar of it. Over the following months, investigators reconstructed the rest. The unauthorized account access was reversed. The property transfer never went through. The home equity line was challenged before Marisol could drain it. Much of the money already taken was traced through her accounts. Marisol eventually faced charges tied to financial exploitation, fraud, coercion, and theft. When the case finally reached resolution, she stopped, insisting everything had been voluntary. The recordings had made that position nearly impossible to maintain. She accepted a plea that resulted in 6.5 years in prison, restitution, and orders preventing her from contacting Eleanor. I attended the sentencing with Daniel, but Eleanor chose not to come. "I've spent enough time in rooms because of her," she told me. I understood. When the judge imposed the sentence, I didn't feel victorious. Marisol was still the mother of my grandchildren, and Daniel was still watching his marriage end in a courtroom. Justice doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it simply stops something bad from continuing. When I returned home, I found Eleanor outside. For the first time since Tulsa, she was kneeling beside one of her garden beds. She had gardening gloves on and a small trowel in her hand. "How did it go?" she asked. 6.5 years. Eleanor nodded once, then turned back to the soil. I crouched beside her. Tiny green shoots were pushing through the bed where I'd assumed everything had died. "What are those?" I asked. "Basil." She brushed dirt away from one of the leaves. "I thought we'd lost it." I looked at her instead of the plant. She knew what I was thinking. "Don't," she said softly. "I'm still here," and she was. But stopping Marisol was only the first part of getting Eleanor back. The harder part would be helping my wife believe that our home, our family, and even her own decisions belong to her again. The harder part would be helping my wife believe that our home, our family, and even her own decisions belong to her again. Marisol went to prison, the disputed property transfer was stopped, and most of the money investigators could trace eventually came back to us. But none of that erased 21 days of fear. For months, Eleanor checked the front door twice before going to bed. If the phone rang unexpectedly, her shoulders tightened. She stopped answering numbers she didn't recognize. Some mornings she stood in the kitchen staring at a simple decision, coffee or tea, eggs or oatmeal, as if choosing the wrong thing might somehow bring consequences. I learned not to choose for her. "What do you want?" became one of the most important questions in our marriage. Slowly, she started answering. She began therapy. Her appetite returned. She gained 6 pounds, then 9. Mrs. Hennings came over with another casserole, and this time Eleanor opened the door herself. They stood there hugging so long that I quietly went outside and left them alone. Daniel and the children moved in with us temporarily after the divorce proceedings began. My grandson filled the hallway with toy trucks. My granddaughter followed Eleanor into the garden carrying a plastic watering can and drowned nearly every tomato plant she touched. Eleanor didn't care. For the first time in months, I heard my wife laugh from the other side of the house. By spring, the garden looked like hers again. Tomatoes climbed their cages. Basil filled 2 beds. Eleanor planted marigolds along the fence because she said the yellow made the yard feel alive. One evening, I found her sitting on the back steps watching the grandchildren chase fireflies. I sat beside her. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Eleanor said, "Do you know what I thought about when you were in Tulsa?" I looked at her. "What?" "Coming home." "Me? Coming home?" She nodded. "Marisol kept telling me you weren't coming back. She said you'd found someone else. She said you were tired of me." Some days I almost believed her. Her voice softened. But every night, after she left, I'd lie in our bed and tell myself the same thing. "What did you tell yourself?" Eleanor looked toward the garden. "Hollis is going to come home." I swallowed hard. "That's what kept you going?" "Some nights, yes." She turned toward me. 41 years is a long time to know somebody. I knew the man who sat beside me through cancer scares, funerals, surgeries, and everything else wouldn't disappear without looking me in the eyes. I reached for her hand. "I came home." Eleanor smiled. "You did. I always will." She rested her head against my shoulder, and we watched our grandchildren run through the yard. "I used to think protecting your family meant being strong enough to stop whatever came through the door. At 68, I learned something different. Sometimes the greatest danger is already inside, wearing a familiar face and speaking in a voice everyone trusts. And sometimes strength isn't shouting, threatening, or demanding revenge. It's noticing the 13 pounds nobody explained. It's checking the camera, saving the recording, calling the bank, sitting beside someone who's frightened and believing them before you demand that they prove why. Marisol took money from us, but money wasn't the worst thing she tried to steal. She tried to make Eleanor doubt her memory, her marriage, her judgment, and eventually herself. Those things took longer to recover than any bank balance. But they did come back. A year after I returned from Tulsa, Eleanor and I stood in the garden harvesting tomatoes while our grandchildren argued over who got to carry the basket. She looked healthier than she had in years. Not because everything had been forgotten. It hadn't. Healing doesn't require forgetting. It means what happened no longer gets to decide what happens next. If there's one thing our family learned, it's this. Pay attention to the people you love. Notice when they become quieter. Notice when routines suddenly change. Notice when someone begins answering for them. And when a person you love finally finds the courage to tell you they're afraid, believe them. That evening, Eleanor squeezed my hand and looked toward the house we'd nearly lost. "I knew you'd come home," she said again. I kissed her forehead. "And I'll keep coming home as long as you need me."